Hi everyone! My name is CA200-ASOY and today I will be discussing the institutional corrections in Lesson 2. So the Lesson 2 contains the history, philosophy, and objectives of imprisonment and the development of prisons. Sing Sing Prison, Auburn System, Pennsylvania System, 5 Deployment of prisoners, forms of punishment, age of enlightenment, personalities behind correctional institution, Cesar Marquez of Vicaria Buenosaya, Cesar Lombroso, William the Conqueror, Enrico Ferri, and Clifford Shaw. We will not discuss Hegel as a philosophy, but we will proceed to the history of imprisonment. So the history is London is known as the birthplace of modern imprisonment. A philosopher named Jeremy Bentham was against the death penalty and thus created a concept for a prison that would be used to hold prisoners as a form of punishment. If people or that person make a mistake, they will punish them. They punish them to make their wrongdoings correct. Retributive justice is response to criminal behavior. It's not a revenge. It is a punish that balancing a wrong sin that person do. Let's give him a punishment in response to his bad behavior. Let us compensate the behavior. If you are raped, the criminal should not go out. Fair judgment, but first you should have a proof or evidence. Since the inmates could not be certain how many guards were present, Bentham reasoned fewer officers would need to be hired to maintain the peace. The original purpose of confining a person within a prison was not to punish them but was a means of keeping the perpetrator of a crime detained until the actual punishment could be carried out. So next is, by the 19th century, prisons were being built for the sole purpose of housing inmates. They were intended to deter people from committing crimes. People who were found guilty or of various crimes would be sent to these penitentiaries and stripped of their personal freedoms. Inmates were often forced to do hard labor while they were incarcerated and to live in very harsh conditions. That picture shown is how prisons changed the balance of power in America. The 14th Amendment, when combined with the war on crime, has paradoxically disenfranchised vast swaths of the population and give the rural white areas surrounding prisons unforeseen political power. Before long, one of the goals of a prison sentence became the rehabilitation of inmates. Many people felt that the fear of being locked up would be enough to deter an inmate from ever committing another crime. But another theorist held that policies should be introduced to help reform prisoners before they were set free. These policies should include mental examinations, educational programs, and sometimes even far more drastic measures such as electroshock therapy. So next is an opposing viewpoint to the rehabilitative effects of imprisonment claims that being incarcerated will actually cause people to become even more involved with a life of crime because they become so enveloped in a criminal society while living with other inmates. Regardless of this conflict, opinions on rehabilitation of criminals imprisonment continues to be one of the most common forms of punishment around the world. So prisons are designed to house people who have broken the law and to remove them from free society. Inmates are locked away for a set period of time and have very limited freedoms. During their incarceration, while every prison serves the same basic purpose, there are many different types of prisons. So next, we will discuss the different types of prisons. First is juvenile. An individual under the age of 18 is considered a juvenile. Anyone who is not a legal age is never locked up in a general prison with adults. They are instead placed in a facility that is designed exclusively for juveniles. Juvenile, if you made a mistake, you will not be put in prison, but the DSWD will get you. They will be the one to discipline you so that you can't do again a bad mistakes again until you will learn Also, juvenile offenders also have special needs. They generally receive age-appropriate education and vocational training with an emphasis on preventing recidivism. Next is minimum, medium, and high security. Minimum security prisons are usually reserved for white-collar criminals who have committed acts such as embezzlement or fraud. Although these are serious crimes, they have non-violent in nature and therefore the perpetrators are not considered to be a risk for violence. These perpetrators are sent to facilities that offer a dormitory-type living environment, fewer guards, and more personal freedoms. Next is medium security prisons. Are the standard facilities used to house most criminals. They feature cage-style housing, armed guards, and a much more regimented daily routine than minimum security. For the majority, there are medium security prisons where prisoners are expected to work, attend educational programs, or participate in other activities that prepare them for release. Finally, there are prisons that have a very low level of security for those who present no threat to public safety. Next is high security prisons are reserved for the most violent and dangerous offenders. These prisons include far more guards than both minimum and medium security, and very little freedom. Each person confined to such a prison is considered to be a high-risk individual. A super maximum security or administrative maximum prison is a control unit prison, or a unit within prisons which represents the most secure levels of custody in the prison systems of certain countries. Next is psychiatric. Lawbreakers who are deemed to be mentally unfit are sent to psychiatric prisons that are designed with resemblance to hospitals. Once there, the inmates or patients receive psychiatric help for their mental disorders. Psychiatric, as with any prison that pursues methods of rehabilitation, psychiatric prisons are intended to try and help people as opposed to just confining them as a means of punishment. So next is military. Every branch of military has its own prison facilities that are used to specifically for military personnel who have broken laws that affect national security or housed to the prisoners of war. In military, the treatment of these prisoners has been a subject of much debate in recent times, and the definition of torture for enemy combatants has become a controversial and often discussed topic. Next is federal versus state. If the crime the prisoner committed is federal, they will likely end up in federal prison. The exception is violent crimes, which are usually dealt with the state prisons. The federal prison system was started with the Three Prison Act of 1891. Federal versus state. Federal prisons are under the jurisdiction of the Federal Bureau of Prisons, or BOP, a subsidiary of the Department of Justice. Each state determines how its correctional system will function. So next is jail versus prison. Jail is a locally operated short-term facility, whereas prison is a state or federally operated long-term facility. Jails are mainly used for detaining inmates awaiting trial or sentencing. They can also house inmates who have been sentenced for less than a year. Let's proceed to the development of the prison system. During the 16th century, a number of the houses of correction were established in Europe for the rehabilitation of minor offenders and vagrants. These emphasized strict discipline and hard labor. Over time, the imprisonment came to be accepted as an appropriate method of punishing convicted criminals. Next is poor sanitation. In these institutions caused widespread disease among prisoners who were generally held unsegregated without any consideration for gender or legal status. Outbreaks of epidemic typhus, known as jail fever, occasionally killed not only prisoners but also jailers and more rarely judges and lawyers involved in trials. Next is the modern prison development in the late 18th century, in part as a reaction to the conditions of the local jails of the time. So the concept of the prison as a penitentiary that is, as a place of punishment and personal reform, was advocated in this period by the English jurist and philosopher Jeremy Bentham, among others. The appalling condition and official corruption in many local prisons or late 18th century England and Wales were exposed by the English prison reformer John Howard, whose work The State of the Prisons in England and Wales 1777 and an account of the principal lazarettos in Europe 1789 were based on extensive travels. As use of the new type of prison expanded, administrators began to experiment with new methods of prisoner rehabilitation. Solitary confinement of criminals came to be viewed as an ideal, because it was thought that solitude would help the offender to become penitent and the penitence would result in rehabilitation. The age of modern prisons that we know today started with the several prison reforms in 19th century England. During that time, prisoners started receiving more care. Concept of rehabilitation was introduced, and governments around the world, especially in UK and US, started reconsidering their views on solitary confinement, which was primary source of the increased numbers of insane, suicidal, and catatonic prisoners. During the end of 20th century, modern prison system was finalized. Concept of the probation service was introduced in 1991. And 3 years before that, first prison intended solely for the holding of inmates in permanent isolation was formed. Those supermax prisons become widespread across the entire United States, with over 40 of them being active. In the year 2005, inmates in those prisons are held in the 23-hour-long periods of cell isolation, with occasional communal yard time, work, educational programs, and meals in cafeteria. As of 2006, it is estimated that over 9 million people are imprisoned worldwide with the United States, leading in the rate of incarceration 743 per 100 people. Next is Sing Sing Prison. When the public thinks about prison, they associate with punishment. When I think about prison, I associate it with structure, security, discipline, education, vocation, and families. I spent many hours thinking about putting 1,700 broken pieces back together, so when they leave this place, they will be prepared to be productive, educated, confident, employed, crime-free people. Michael Capra, superintendent Sing Sing Correctional Facility, said. So in Sing Sing, in full Sing Sing Correctional Facility, maximum security prison located in Ossining, New York. In use since 1826, it is one of the oldest penal institutions in the United States. It is also among the most well-known in the country, especially notable for its harsh condition in the 19th and 20th century. That picture shown is the Sing Sing prison on the Hudson River at Ossining, New York. One of the notable visitors to the prison was Alexis de Tocqueville, author of Democracy in America. The French government sent him and Gustave de Beaumont to the United States in 1331 to gather information about the American penal system. Today, Sing Sing is considered a model correctional facility with its innovative rehabilitation programs for the incarcerated. So, there are famous prisoners at Sing Sing. So, who are the most famous prisoner at Sing Sing? So, let's discover it. So, first is Albert Fish. The legendary serial killer and cannibal was executed at Sing Sing in January 1936. Second is David Berkowitz. David Richard Berkowitz, born Richard David Falco, June 1, 1953, also known as the son of Sam and the 44 caliber killer, is an American serial killer who pleaded guilty to 8 separate shooting attacks that began in New York City during the summer of 1976. And third is Ruth Brown Sandner. This murderer was imprisoned at Sing Sing and was executed via the electric chair in 1928. That some prisoners are famous at Sing Sing. So next is why jail called Sing Sing. The name Sing Sing was derived from the Saint Sing Indian tribe from whom the land was purchased in 1685 and was formerly the name of the village. Why jail called Sing Sing? It is because in 1970, the prison's name was changed to the Ossining Correctional Facility, but it reverted to its original name in 1985. Sing Sing was also the site of reforms that affected the national penal system. Reformer Thomas Mott Osborne, who developed his penology theories while voluntarily incarcerated for a year at Auburn, served as Sing Sing's warden in 1914 to 15 and 1916. Sing Sing's name comes from the Indian phrase Sing Sing. It means stone on stone. 1901, 3 years after Edison introduced the electric chair at Sing Sing. The town changed its name to Ossining so people wouldn't confuse it with the jail. More reforms were instituted under Lewis Edward Lewis, who served as warden from 1920 to 1941. The two reformer Thomas Mott Osborne was an American prisoner administrator, prison reformer, industrialist, and New York State political reformer. His career as a penologist was short, but in the interval of the few years he served, he succeeded in revolutionizing American prison reform. If not always in fact, then in awakening responsibility, he was made of the spectacular stuff of martyrs. To many people perhaps ridiculous, but to those who live his stories most closely touched, inspiring, and often godlike. So Lewis Edward Lewis was a prison warden and proponent of prison reform. During his 21-year tenure at Sing Sing Correctional Facility, he supervised the executions of 303 prisoners, a world-famous penologist. Lewis was best known for his 21-year stint as warden of Sing Sing and for his often extraordinary ability to keep his viewpoints on crime and punishment in the public eye. Next is Sing Sing prison cell. As you can see the pictures that the prisoners stayed. A cell at Sing Sing Prison, Ossining, New York City, 1910 to 1950. Library, Congress, Washington, D.C. So in 1901, the residents of Sing Sing Village changed its name to Ossining. They wanted to distance, if not disassociate, the town from the notorious prison. For that the same reason, 1970, the state renamed the prison Ossining Correctional Facility. So Auburn State Prison located in Auburn, New York, opened in 1816. It established a disciplinary and administrative system based on silence, corporal punishment, and congregate group labor in architecture and routine. Auburn became the model for prisons throughout the United States. So the Auburn system's purpose was to have harsher punishment and isolation from others. The Auburn system's main features originally started off as isolation without labor, which failed and thus transferred into labor during the day and solitary at night. Another main feature of the Auburn system was silence amongst the inmates. The main principle behind the Auburn system was to punish the inmates by teaching the habits of society and how to obey. Their methods were not rehabilitative based but on harsh punishment. In the early 19th century, many Americans believed that industrialization and dramatic demographic and economic and political upheavals had conspired against the traditional controls of family, church, and community. From their perspective, these moral guardians could no longer adequately control disorder. Auburn Prison explanation in contrast with the purely informatory type prison instituted in Pennsylvania, the Philadelphia system introduced by the Quakers, the Auburn system, modified the schedule of prayer, contemplation, and dooming conditions with hard labor. Lockstep in the Auburn prison, female prisoners in Auburn's workshop. The two picture is based on what the Auburn do. So, Elam Lenz, the first warden of the Auburn Penitentiary, is credited with creating the Auburn or congregate system. So, Captain Elam Lenz, 1784 to 1855, was a prison warden. He helped create the Auburn system, which consisted of congregate labor during the day and isolation at night, starting in 1821, and was warden of Sing Sing from 1825 to 1830. So next is borrowing from the Pennsylvania system. The Auburn prison system banned the death penalty, except for murder and treason, and physical punishment, though outlawed as a sentence, remained within the prison as a means of discipline. So prisoners were compelled to work during the day, and the profit of their labor helped to support the prison. Prisoners were segregated by offense. Additionally, they were issued clothing that identified their crime. The traditional American prison uniform, consisting of horizontal black and white stripes, originated at the Auburn prison. So that image is the Auburn Correctional Facility of New York. The Auburn system was a prison model consisting of small individual cells, large work area for group labor, and enforced silence. The New York State Prison at Auburn opened in 1819. So the Auburn prison administrators developed a system that was almost the opposite of that used at the Eastern Penitentiary. The discipline regimen at Auburn also included congregate work in shops during the day, separation of prisoners into small individual cells at night, silence at all times, lockstep marching formation, and a congregate meal at which the prisoners sat face to back. In belief that verbal exchange between prisoners was contaminating conversation was prevented by liberal use of the whip. Auburn structural design with inside cells and wings composed of 4 tiers of cells, like cell blocks, became the model for the most prisons built in the following 150 years. Cell blocks multi-tier living cells usually stacked on a top the other, built with a hollow building and not touching exterior walls. If we talk about their prison competition, the Auburn or congregate system was cheaper to construct and got started, offered better vocational training, and produced more money for the state. In the end, the congregate system, prison modeled on the Auburn system with inmate work and feeding done in inmates in total silence, was adopted in almost all other American prisons. Let's proceed to Pennsylvania prison system. When Penn died in 1718, his reforms died with him, and Pennsylvania again joined the other colonies in their mistreatment of convicted criminals. In 1787, after the signing of the U.S. Constitution, a group of Quakers, Benjamin Franklin among them, formed a group which came to be the Pennsylvania Prison Society. So Penn's is established. The part an unforeseen problem with the reform was the influx of prisoners. This brought overcrowding and financial strain. So once again, the hard-fought humanitarian reform seemed in jeopardy. A separate system, meaning isolation and solitude, was instituted where the prisoners would have time to reflect on their crimes and become reformed. Thus, the Pennsylvania prison system was born, and the focus again went from retribution to rehabilitation, where efforts were made to change the prisoner into an honest citizen. Punishment, the infliction of some kind of pain or loss upon a person for a misdeed of a law or command. Punishment may take forms ranging from capital punishment, flogging, forced labor, and mutilation of the body to imprisonment and fines. Deferred punishments consist of penalties that are imposed only if an offense is repeated within a specified time. To establish this system, a jail on Walnut Street was converted to a prison, which included single rooms for isolation for all but 10 minutes a day. The system contained the following attributes: isolation to foster penitence, as the prisoner had time to reflect on his or her misdeeds; humanitarian base to provide better food and healthcare; prisoners to work alone to make goods and learn a trade. The focus moved from retribution to rehabilitation. So William Penn was an English writer and religious thinker belonging to the Religious Society of Friends and founder of the province of Pennsylvania, a North American colony of England. So what is William Penn most known for? So William Penn was an English Quaker leader and advocate of religious freedom who oversaw the founding of Pennsylvania as a refuge for Quakers and other religious minorities of Europe. This prison was built like a square wheel, with the cell blocks arranged like spokes around the hub or central rotunda. The routine at Eastern was solitary confinement, silence, and labor in outside cells. So the Auburn system with big inside cells, prison cells that do not touch the outside walls of the cell block. An unfortunate byproduct of the badly planned Auburn experiment was the use of solitary confinement as a means of punishment within the prison. There was great emphasis on silence. So outside cells, prison cells attached to a corridor with the back of the cell extending outward toward a peripheral wall. If we talk about prison competition, supporters of the Pennsylvania system claim it was easier to control the prisoners, gave more consideration to their individual needs, prevented contamination by the complete separation of prisoners from one another, and provided more opportunity for meditation and penitence. So different types of criminal punishment. The following are the 5 of the most commonly seen types of criminal punishment. Prison system was improved and the first attempts were made to study psychology of crime and to distinguish between classes of criminals. So first is incapacitation, seeks to prevent future crime by physical moving criminals away from society. So second is deterrence. Deterrence aims at reducing the number of accidents by imposing a heavy financial cost on unsafe conduct. So first is specific deterrence, analyzes how effective punishment is on an individual's future behavior. Second is general deterrence, aims to dissuade others from following the offenders. Example, less concerned with the future behaviors of the offender himself. General deterrence theories assume that because most individuals are rational, potential offenders will calculate the risk of being similarly caught, prosecuted, and sentenced for the commission of a crime. So third is marginal deterrence. The principle of law enforcement implies that penalties must be scaled according to the severity of crimes in order to deter individuals from committing more severe offenses. And next is partial deterrence, refers to situations in which the threat of sanction has some deterrent value even when the sanction threats do not lead to law-abiding behavior. Next is deterrent theory has proven difficult to validate, however, largely because the presence of many intervening factors makes it difficult to prove unequivocally that a certain penalty has prevented someone from committing a given crime. So let's proceed to retribution. The retributive theory of punishment holds that punishment is justified by the moral requirements that the guilty make amends for the harm they have caused to society. Next is rehabilitation. The idea that the purpose of punishment is to apply treatment and training to the offender so that he is made capable of returning to society and functioning as a law-abiding member of the community. So fifth is restoration. Response to criminal behavior that focuses on lawbreaker restitution and the resolution of the issues arising from a crime in which victims, offenders, and the community are brought together to restore the harmony between the parties. Now, let's proceed to personalities behind correctional institutions. First is Cesar Beccaria, in full Cesar Bunisana Marquez Indibicaria. So he was born on March 15, 1738 at Milan, Italy, and died November 28, 1794 at Milan. He is Italian criminologist and economist whose De Deleti del Penny, English transformed for Crimes and Punishment, was a celebrated volume on the reform of criminal justice. So Cesar Beccaria theory is the classical crime theory. Especially according to Beccaria, is based on the assumption that people are free of will and thus completely responsible for their own actions, and that they also have the ability to rationally weigh up their abilities. So Cesar Beccaria Justice and Law. By 18th century, European states had developed brutal justice system that deal with inadequate policing powers. It is all about punish and prevent. So Cesar Beccaria, Italian philosopher and political on crimes and punishment at the year 1764 and condemned to torture and the death penalty. In On Crimes and Punishment, Beccaria argued, first is punishment should not be excessive, should be proportionate to the crime. Second is the death penalty does not deter crime. The state does not have the right to take lives. Third is procedures of criminal convictions and punishment should be public and prompt. And last is for overall reform of the legal system. So let's talk about the Cesar Beccaria of his main beliefs. Beccaria believed that laws existed to maintain social order, not to get revenge for crimes. A person who is on trial for a crime should have a quick trial without torturing witnesses. and he thought capital punishment should be abolished. And last, most importantly, he said that the degree of punishment should be decided by the degree of the law. And let's proceed to his published works. He published the Crimes and Punishment at the year 1764, and also he published an essay on crimes and punishment at the year 1793. His works are very truthful, and he helped also those prisoners. So let's proceed to the influences and legacies. So vicarious criminal justice ideas influenced the U.S. Constitution, Bill of Rights, and justice system through his ideas of prosecution, punishment, and arrest. His ideas had torture outlawed and reduced in Europe and Americas. So if we talk about the vicarious codes, his quote is about crimes are more effectually prevented by the certainty that the severity of punishment, and the murder that is depicted as a horrible crime is repeated cold-blooded, remorselessly, and happy is the nation without a history. So his quote is about how people treat the criminal in the prison. And also, he is well remembered for his treatise on crimes and punishment at the year 1764, which condemned torture and the death penalty and was founding work in the field of penology and the classical school of criminology. Beccaria is considered the father of modern criminal law and the father of criminal justice. So let's proceed to a theory of deterrence. On crimes and punishment, Beccaria 1764. So punishment protects the social contract. Punishment should fit the crime, no more. And underlying theory, prevention through deterrence is the primary justification for punishment and condemned by the Catholic Church. So what did Cesar Beccaria believe in? Beccaria believed that people have a rational manner and apply it toward making choices that will help them achieve their own personal gratification. So Marquess of Beccaria Bonisaya, Beccaria himself dated his discovery of the Enlightenment to 1761 when he began to read the works of the French and Scottish philosophers and discussed them with a circle of young friends led by Pietro Verri. So Verri, Beccaria, and their cohort wished to modernize and rationalize the economy and the legal system in line with Enlightenment secular morality, and they supported governmental reform. On Crimes and Punishment was first published in 1764 with subsequent editions following rapidly. Beccaria prepared the edition now regardless as definitive in 1766. Voltaire composed a commentary on it. On Crimes and Punishment combines elements from social contract theory with utilitarian positions. It touches on many aspects of law and justice in a rapid, impassioned style, completely abjuring legal technique or abilities. The penalties themselves should be carefully proportioned to the corresponding crimes and calibrated to deliver the minimum of punishment necessary. Beccaria sought all cases to minimize or abolish the use of violence and the infliction of pain. He argued against the use of torture in gathering of evidence, highlighting its absurdity, and against the death penalty, emphasizing its failure to deter. The thrust of the work was to guarantee the individual citizen against arbitrariness, daily as secrecy, and useless and excessive violence in the codification of the law and the application of penal sanctions. So next is Cesar Lombroso. Described as the father of modern criminology, Cesar Lombroso's theory of the born criminal dominated thinking about criminal behavior in the late 19th and early 20th century. So, from this belief, he developed a theory of deviance in which a person's bodily constitution indicates whether or not an individual is a born criminal. These criminals are throwback to an earlier stage of a human evolution with physical makeup, mental capabilities, and instinct of primitive man. Though the debate has a muted and biological explanation for deviance and crime, is still commonplace. Cesar Lombroso argued that criminality was a biological threat found in some human beings. From the word born criminal means, Lombroso stated that the born criminal could be anatomically identified by such items as a sloping forehead, ears of unusual size, asymmetry of the face, excessive length of arms, asymmetry of the cranium, dark skin, and other physical stigma. Cesar Lombroso, who was a prison doctor and forensic physician, conducted countless investigations on prisoners and patients in psychiatric institutions. So Lombroso published the result of his investigations in his main work, L'Homo Delinquente, The Criminal Man, the first published in 1876. So Lombroso's born criminal atavisms, so criminals as evolutionary throwbacks, physical traits, stigma, so stigma, a mark of disgrace associated with particular circumstance, quality, or a person. So peak nose, low forehead, large jaws, strong canine teeth, general hairiness of the body, low foreheads. So Lombroso argued that criminals could be identified through general characteristics they shared with one another, which he designated as composing a criminal type. His core idea was atavism, which means that he understood criminals to be evolutionary throwbacks who were inferior to non-criminals. So criminal man delineated his idea of atavism. Example of stigma: large arms, large lips, crooked nose, large amount of body hair, eyes of different colors, ears that lack defined lobes. Numerous illustrations illustrate his research work. So certain body characteristics and skull shapes are associated with certain types of criminals and crimes. So as you can see the image that are the different description of a criminals, as Lombroso said. So next is characteristics of criminal: a twisted nose, long arms, excessive wrinkles on the skin, large jaw, large chin. So Cesar Lombroso concluded that the criminals were physically different. The physical characteristics that he used to identify prisoners included an asymmetry of the face or head, large monkey-like ears, large lips. On November 6, 1835, October 19, 1909, was the founder of the Italian School of Positivism Criminology. He rejected the established classical school, which held that crime was a characteristic trait of human nature, that rational choices were the foundation of behavior. Lombroso, using a scientific approach and concepts drawn from Signomen, early eugenics, psychiatry, and social Darwinism, argued that criminality was inherited and that the born criminal could be identified by physical defects, which confirmed a criminal as a savage or atavistic. Next is William the Conqueror, usually known as William the Conqueror and sometimes William the Bastard. Was the first Norman king of England, reigning from 1066 until his death in 1087. Before he became the King of England, William I was one of the mightiest nobles in France as the Duke of Normandy, but he is the best remembered for leading the Norman conquest of England in 1066, which changed the course of English history and earned him the sobriquet William the Conqueror. William, as depicted in the Bayeux Tapestry during the Battle of Hastings, lifting his helmet to show that he is still alive. French became the language of the king's court and gradually blended with the Anglo-Saxon tongue to give birth to modern English. The laws of William the Conqueror, the laws introduced by William the Conqueror after his victory at Hastings in 1066, had an impact on everybody in England. These laws were introduced by William to control the English. William has a gained reputation of being nothing more than a tyrant in England. William the Conqueror and the feudal system. After the Battle of Hastings, the Normans, led by William the Conqueror and his army, now marched on Dover, where he remained for a week. He then went north, calling in on Canterbury before arriving on the outskirts of London. After his coronation, William the Conqueror claimed that all the land in England now belonged to him. William retained about a fifth of his land for his own use. Another 25% went to the church. The rest were given to 170 tenants-in-chief or barons who had helped him defeat Harold at the Battle of Hastings. Battle of Hastings in 1065, Edward the Confessor became very ill. Harold of Wessex claimed that Edward promised him the throne just before he died on 5th January 1066. William also had to deal with raids on the north led by King Sweyn of Denmark. In September 1069, Sweyn's fleet sailed into the Humber and burnt York. William's army forced the Danes to retreat and then crushed another uprising in Staffordshire. He then burned crops, house, and property of people living between York and Durham. Was William the Conqueror a good king? William first approved an effective king of England, and the Domesday Book, a great census of the lands and people of England, was among his notable achievements. Upon the death of William I in 1087, his son William Rufus became William II, the second Norman king of England. Next is Enrico Ferri, 25 February 1856, 12 April 1929, was an Italian criminologist, socialist, and student of Cesare Lombroso, the founder of the Italian School of Criminology. While Lombroso researched anthropological criminology, Ferri focused more on social and economic influences on the criminal and crime rates. Ferri's research led to him postulating theories calling for crime prevention methods to be the mainstay of law enforcement as opposed to punishment of criminals after their crimes had taken place. What is the theory of Enrico Ferri? His disciple Enrico Ferri developed the theory of C. Lombroso and belonged to the criminal sociology school. He believed that the reason of crime is not completely determined by the individual's biological genes, but the result of the combination of sociological genes, natural conditions, and social environment. Criminal Sociology, 1905. In 1905, Enrico Ferri published another book titled Criminal Sociology. In this work, he discussed a wide range of problems that he saw within the criminal justice system and criminal as a whole at the time. A lot of the topics he discussed still can be seen in the way we look at criminality today. When he was going over whether the decreasing prison population was really coming from less criminality, he looked into what sentences had been for particular crimes in the past and then what they were when he saw the decrease. He saw that it was not an indication of criminality decreasing in the population. What he found was that sentences and fees had been reduced. Another big thing that he discussed was the difference between a habitual offender and an occasional offender. To go into depth, he said there are actually 5 types of criminals, those who are born with it. The criminally insane, what he called a passional criminal, occasional offenders, and habitual offenders. Instead of a decrease in a crime, there was just a change in the judicial system at the time. Ferri said that this judicial system had become lenient and was more unwilling to prosecute those who had committed minor crimes. Before seeing those, it was thought that the criminality was drastically going down. He discussed how issues in society could affect the outcomes of criminality of the time. He split all offenders up into 5 different categories that he discussed in depth and went in depth to discuss if lower prison population really shows that there is less crime. And last is Clifford Shaw, 1895 to 1957, was an American sociologist and criminologist. He was a major figure in the Chicago School of Sociology during the 1930s and 1940s, and is considered to be one of the most influential figures in American criminology. Clifford Shaw and Henry Mackay. Their cultural deviance theory suggests that conformity to the prevailing cultural norms of lower class society causes crime. Researchers Clifford Shaw and Henry Mackay, 1942, studied crime patterns in Chicago in the early 90s. So, the original purpose of confining a person within a prison was not to punish them, but was a means of keeping the perpetrator of a crime detained until the actual punishment could be carried out. This was usually the form of corporal punishment that was extended to cause the guilty person pain, such as being beaten with a whip, or capital punishment, which caused a variety of methods to claim the lives of condemned individuals. That picture shown is how prisons changed the balance of power in America. The 14th Amendment, when combined with the war on crime, has a paradoxically designed franchise vast swaths of the population, and given the rural white areas surrounding the prisons, unforeseen political power. New immigrants, many of them poor and lacking knowledge of the English language, live in neighborhoods inside the city. As the urban population expanded, wealthier people moved to the suburbs and left behind the less privileged. Before long, one of the goals of a prison sentence became the rehabilitation of inmates. Many people felt that the fear of being locked up be enough to deter an inmate from ever committing another crime. But other theorists held that policies should be introduced to help reform prisoners before they were set free. So that the theory of Shaw and Mackay has been further tested and expounded upon by Robert Sampson and Byron Groves. 1989, recent studies Sampson conducted with Lydia Bean, 2006, revealed similar findings. High rates of poverty and single-parent homes correlated with high rates of juvenile violence. So that are the sources and references that I get from the Google. Thank you for listening. That's all. Thank you.